So this year, the International Education and Training Program, or ITEP, is celebrating our 40th anniversary, and we're marking the occasion with a series of events. The first event is also the first ever annual lecture series to honor our former director, Professor Charles Tosconi. Our featured speaker is Professor Rita Kohli, but before introducing Rita, I would like to introduce the Dean of the School of Education, Dr. Cheryl Holcomb-McCoy, who will say a few words. Over to you, Cheryl.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Lizzie. Really appreciate the introduction, and good evening, everyone. And welcome, as Lizzie just said, to our first annual Dr. Charles Tosconi lecture. I just want to thank openly the faculty and staff and the students of our International Training and Education Program for organizing this truly important event and a milestone in our School of Education. I think it's so fitting that our ITEP program instituted this lecture. Dr. Tosconi, or Charlie, as we affectionately called him, was a faculty member primarily affiliated with ITEP when he came. However, Charlie was more than just a faculty member in our School of Education. He was in many ways the heart and soul of our school for many, many years. And matter of fact, I came to AU primarily because of Charlie. He was very persuasive in getting me to really think about coming. But, what was more important, he was just so inspiring. There are not many people that you meet that they're true believers to the core. His belief in dismantling inequities and disparities in education was so deep. And because of his deep belief in me to come to AU, I came, and that's why I'm here. So a very special place Charlie played in my life. Charlie was a revered professor emeritus, and for some of you that are on this call that might not know that, he was a professor emeritus in the School of Education, but he was also a significant figure in our school's history. He served as Dean of the School of Education from 1989 to 1993, and then again in 1996 to 2000. Now that's really odd. Most people don't come back to be Dean again, but Charlie did because he believed in our school and was truly a servant leader. He was also Dean of the College of Education and Social Services and Professor of Education at the University of Vermont from 1978 to 1989. And he served on the faculties of Ithaca College, the University of Illinois, Chicago, and was a visiting professor at The Ohio State University. Again, I admired Charlie, and he became a quick friend and mentor. He was just easy to laugh, easy to love, and was just a wonderful human being. We miss him greatly physically, but I feel his presence every day through our equity, decolonization, and anti-racism work that we're doing now in our School of Education. He believed in the right of every child to have opportunities to thrive and be successful. And today's talk about teachers of diversifying the teacher workforce, I know he would surely be right here enjoying this discussion today. To fully commemorate this first lecture, I would like to introduce to you Charlie's wife, and now a scholar in residence in our School of Education, Dr. Janice Wright. And Dr. Wright, or Janice, embodies Charlie's core values, his intellect, and his vision for equity and equality in education. And we are certainly delighted, elated, and excited to have her as part of our community now. And so, being the first lecture, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Wright so that she can share a few words with you as well. Dr. Wright.
Thank you. I'm going to read to you just because I need to read, not because it's long, I promise. It's a privilege to be here in Charlie's memory. Lizzie and ITEP were so important to him. All who knew Charlie knew his dedication to education equity. His values didn't grow from positive school experiences, as many of our values did not, as a matter of fact. He grew up in a small town where the schools were unbelievably segregated. Not only did he go to a Catholic school, he went to the Italian Catholic school, which was a few blocks away from the French Catholic school, and around a few corners from the Polish Catholic school, and at the bottom of the hill from the Irish Catholic school. This in a town of about 18,000 people. Charlie recognized inequities in this system, in the different prospects for students, and in the certainty that where you could go in life was a function of where you came from. And he set out from the beginning of his career to indict and to change that system. His focus was on education in the United States. It was what he knew and what he studied and what he wrote about. Paulo Freire introduced him to the larger world, and when he was dean at the University of Vermont, Charlie invited Freire to address us there. It was at AU, though, where Charlie's eyes were truly open to the richness of applying concepts of equity in the world. Lizzie so impressed him with her intellect and enthusiasm, and she, along with the dynamic, committed, and very entertaining ITEP students, grew his dedication to globalizing concepts of equity. Lizzie and the ITEPers moved Charlie to be a globalist, and they all had a wonderful time together as they traveled that road. It's fitting that this first memorial lecture in a way goes back to Charlie's roots, focusing on schools in the US while illuminating global values and principles. At the time I was reading Dr. Kohli's book, Teachers of Color, I happened across a statement by Nelson Mandela and thought it was so providential that I had to share it. Mandela said, "A good head and good heart are always a formidable combination. But when you add to that literate tongue or pen, then you have something very special." What a lovely tribute to Charlie and his work that we gather in honor of his memory to discuss Dr. Kohli's literate, formidable, very special book.
Great, Janice, thank you. Dr. Wright, thank you so much.
Good boy, Janice.
Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Rita Kohli, who's an associate professor of teaching and teacher education in the Graduate School of Education at the University of California, Riverside. Building on her experience as an urban public middle school teacher and a teacher educator, she has spent the last decade researching race, power, and inequity and equity, and the professional experiences and well-being of teachers of color. Committed to praxis, she's also the co-founder and co-director of the Institute for Teachers of Color, committed to racial justice. As you all know, tonight we'll be discussing her most recent book, Teachers of Color, Resisting Racism and Reclaiming Education. So I'll begin. So Rita, like you, I research teachers because they're critical, as we know, to any educational experience. You can have whatever policy you like, whatever curriculum, you can have the best textbook possible, but teachers still shut the classroom door, right? They are so critical and often overlooked. And I also like to research them because they're interesting and they're cool. And it's so much more interesting to talk to teachers than study textbooks or curriculum. But we know teachers are not widgets or technicians. They're complicated individuals with a range of life experiences and goals and dreams and emotions, just like the rest of us. So I was so excited to read your book, which really is a love letter to the teachers of color who resist the structural racism in both their professional and personal lives, and to the teachers of color that you write about who create these educational spaces and approaches that are so beyond our imagining. In the book you write about someone who creates an ethnomathematics program or restorative science pedagogy, these incredibly inspiring teachers. So many in the audience have not read your book, so I thought I would read one passage to sort of highlight the framing and approach to your book. And then I have some questions for you. So for page 4, you write, to understand and address the diversity crisis of the teaching force, it is necessary to move beyond discussion of racial representation. Teachers of color are not simply a vehicle for student success, but rather are whole people with professional goals and oftentimes dreams for their communities. In this book, I invite readers into the lives of 30 justice-oriented teachers of color to understand the impact of racism in schools on their well-being and their professional retention, growth, and success. Through their narratives, I also explore their resistance to racism and their reimagination of classrooms, schools, and districts as they work to reclaim education and create the learning spaces they feel students of color deserve. And you also identify then 3 tools or three aspects of these teachers' toolkit to help them navigate the hostile racial climates and to reclaim education. And you write that they use their racial literacies and developing communities of resistance and organizing for change are the three things that you found help teachers resist. So my first question is, you have these 30 teachers. I'm curious about your methodology. How did you find the teachers? How did you conduct the interviews in person, over the phone? Also, was it over time? So you have this incredibly emotional and almost kind of hard to read chapter about these teachers that are pushed out in the system and what happened to those teachers. And last, these stories are often quite traumatic. And you as a researcher, how did you take care of yourself when you were collecting these stories, listening to them, and then analyzing them?
Thanks so much for those thoughtful questions. I appreciate the last question was something I had to reflect on as you sent it to me yesterday, but I'll start with just talking about the book and the teachers in there. So the book was built on ideas that I've conceptualized and researched over the last 10 years of my career. I had done, starting with my dissertation work, was with pre-service teachers of color in a teacher ed program. And that evolved into trying to study teachers as they left the programs and went into classrooms, and I saw them being pushed out. And so I did research there. And then wanting to understand from the veteran educators, how they stayed. And so over this decade, I had these different studies that kind of encapsulated this arc. And I had the opportunity to try to think about how to synthesize them. And so in that range of research and my work with the Institute for Teachers of Color Committed to Racial Justice, we've collected qualitative questionnaires from hundreds of teachers over that time. We have had digital narrative self-interviews with around 50 teachers and interviews with 25 to 30, more in-depth interviews with 25 to 30 teachers for one study, another study with 15. So I had all this data over time. And so these are teachers that, as I was in these research projects with, they often were part of our conference as well, or part of our community. And so I stayed in touch with them. So when I was writing the book, or decided to write the book, I went back to them and I said, I remember this about your story, and I'd like to interview you more deeply about it. And so it was really interesting to be able to talk to them when I first met them, and then be able to come back to them. And so there's one story in particular, Bayani, who I had interviewed him when he was a first-year teacher, and he was just really struggling in the classroom, really feeling a lot of racial battle fatigue, really feeling isolated and alone. And when I went back to him for the book, it was, I think, his 8th year teaching. And I reminded him of this digital interview that we had where he was so upset and isolated. And because he had engaged in some of the tools that you named and had this kind of community was part of this organizing movement for ethnic studies in his district, he actually didn't even remember that. So in the narrative, he had punched a wall. He was so upset, and I'm like, remember when you it's so amazing to see you so positive and so hopeful and so excited, because last time we talked, this is what happened, and he didn't even remember that, right? And so I think it was really amazing to be able to do these interviews, already kind of having theorized through my research what the themes were, what the ideas were, and then coming back to people to really say, well, I want to flesh out this narrative. So that was kind of the methods that I took. And as I mentioned, most had been part of the professional development community that I run. And so in that space, they found, a lot of them have found a place. And so some of the teachers who were sharing so vulnerably with me, it was very intense. I mean, a lot of the interviews took place during the pandemic. So it was already so intense what was happening around us. But I remember, we have this in-person connection. I know that they've been part of this community where we've done things like we've had Theater of the Oppressed, where they've acted out some of their trauma, and been with others, kind of laughing at their dramatics, their reenactments of these moments of harm where they get to play out the problematic principle, or they get to play out their peer in these over exaggerated ways, and these things that were so intense and caused so much pain. I've seen them be together and feel so much joy and connection, that it really helped me understand and, see the power of what's possible. And so, yeah, I mean, I definitely feel like it was very hard to hear some of the stories. And for others, it was so inspiring to really learn from and with kind of the things that they were saying, and being able to kind of synthesize and theory build. So it was a very emotional journey for me as well. So I appreciate that question.
I'm sure it was. I can't imagine that, but I like how you had that balance, right? Of the traumatic stories, but the inspiring and uplifting stories. But also your answer made me think about something, about the ways in which teachers change over time, right? Again, these are individuals, right? And so how, I guess we need to even think more about that, as teachers, early career to mid-career to late career, right? The ways in which not only their practices change, but their sense of self, how they respond to, racism that you talk about in the book. But I'm thinking about that as we talk about teachers as complicated individuals, but complicated individuals that are also evolving, right? So the story of looking at maybe a teacher over the arc of their career. And it was just a comment that was making me think about teachers over time. So thank you for answering all that.
I was just going to add too that, I mean, I'm telling particular bits of their story to highlight something, but I think also, even though the book is a little bit more in depth than maybe we see in a journal article, we're still not seeing the whole arc of their experience, right? And so even some of the stories where they're experiencing trauma and harm, maybe I'm not going into all the ways that they have found, spaces to resist or places to find solace.
But I think you give us a good picture of that. My second question has to do with this idea of status quo stories, which I had never heard of this framework, and I'm really captivated by it. And you write on page 113, you define status quo stories as worldviews that normalize and naturalize the existing system. So when you think about this for education, you write, the social systems, values, and standards that govern our educational system have remained so constant that we have normalized the impossibility of meaningful change. And you use this example of how classrooms are set up, right? So a classroom in 1880 had, rows of desks with, a teacher in the front of the room. A classroom in 1980 has the same structure. And so I'm really struck by this idea of the status quo. And I was thinking about it with the purpose of education, right? I think for so many of us, we have sort of like one defined idea or definition of the purpose of education that we don't actually probably question. And in the book, you talk a little bit about teachers who talk about education for liberation. But I was wondering, how your teachers of color define or think about the purpose of education, education for liberation, education for the workplace, social economic advancement, a means to affirm, to uplift children of color. I mean, was there a range of definitions, anything that surprised you?
Yeah, I'm not sure that that's specifically what I asked of them, but most of the teachers, many of the teachers that were part of the book said that it was just echoed throughout, that they wanted to be the teacher they never had, that they wanted to be the teacher that didn't engage in the harm the way they experienced teachers to be, that saw that saw students the way they wish they had been seen, the way they wish their families had been seen. They wanted to create spaces to reflect and support the growth of children and communities that they deeply cared about. And so I think, that there was a range of their approaches. And I think we see that through the chapters focused on resistance and reimagination, where, the way they approach it is so intertwined with who they are and their experiences. their positionalities, the communities that they serve, whether that is in Hawaii, really tapping into kind of indigenous Pacific Islander kind of traditions, whether that is, in Southern California, in the desert, really reclaiming the school districts to rebuild it through a lens of ethnic studies. And so I think those visions differed, but one of the things that I saw as really constant was trying to disrupt an educational system that isn't designed for many marginalized communities, but those children are expected to go there, right? Families are expected to send their kids there. And so how do we start to reclaim those hours and days and months and years of our children's lives so that they can have those spaces that one of the last stories talks about, so they can find out how great they truly are, right? So kids can really be who they are and be who they could be, as opposed to what sometimes happens in our educational system.
Great, thank you so much. I was thinking about this, I told you a little bit about this because in my work in Northern Ireland, it's sort of our status quo stories as scholars and researchers of education, that schools should be transformative places. It's our status quo story that education is transformative. But in Northern Ireland, I've been surprised because that's not held by all. A lot of teachers that I've interviewed don't see schools as transformative places. They see schools as a place to protect children and to nurture children, like literally protect children during the 30-year, conflict of the Troubles, but now protect children of like provide the safe space, away from sectarian conflict, and also to prepare children for the workplace. And this cut across both advantaged and disadvantaged groups, like to help students get the best, A-level exam scores, and then to help those that were disadvantaged, work towards social mobility through education. And so I've been thinking about this, and I don't think we'll be able to answer it, but, how do we have a conversation about dismantling like status quo stories of education when we have these multiple and like competing voices, and how do we honor everyone's view, right? So I've just been thinking about this connection to my own work. And can we talk about, education for liberation, or being the teacher that I never had, right? With also education for the workplace, for, social mobility. So I don't know if that can be done, but just if you have any thoughts, thinking out loud about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a scholar of race and racialization in our educational system in the United States, and I come from the tradition of critical race theory, which I think you might have heard of these days. But coming from those traditions and really understanding what it means to be a racialized person in the United States, a minoritized person in the United States, I wonder if the goal should be to honor everyone's views. I'm not sure that is necessarily the goal when we have views that are directly harmful to certain communities. So rather, I wonder if honoring everybody's humanity and dignity should be our goal, right? Because those don't always align. And so I think, if your viewpoint is harmful or marginalizing to a minoritized community, when we disagree, it's not just about the ideas. And so sometimes this idea that debate is healthy, disagreement is democratic, can be fine about particular ideas, but when we're discussing if someone's family should be torn apart and someone should be deported, or if someone's history should be taught or neglected, or someone's language should be utilized or degraded in schools, those are not just a range of ideas, right? And so I think when we're talking about a student population where over half of the students enrolled in US public schools are students of color, yet we continue to operate through a curriculum that is race evasive, and we have, this anti kind of race discussions popping up everywhere and trying to be integrated into legislation, into school board meetings, and so I think it becomes complicated because we're talking about a suppression of an understanding of the realities. And for young people of color, we need to have access. They need to have access to these ideas. I think about my own children in school. They need to have access to these ideas to make sense of the world around them. I mean, we all should have access to these ideas, right? And so, I guess I wonder about, when we dismantle the status quo stories of education, part of that has to include that that idea of standardization and really questioning standardizing towards whose lens, whose comfort, whose perspective.
I love that, dismantling the standardization. Good, okay, I'm gonna change directions. Like I can keep talking about purposes of education. So towards the end of the book, you talk about some policy recommendations, specifically for teacher prep programs and school and district leaders. And on page 54, you have some suggestions like hiring rubrics, providing racial literacy development for existing staff, forming compensated committees for racial justice work. My question is, how can this be done without being performative, right? How can we go beyond just having this as a checklist?
That's a great question. I think that's a question every school bed should be asking themselves. I think part of having a racial literacy, when we talk about it on an individualized level, that's having an understanding of how structural racism operates and a commitment to disrupting it. And I think that could happen on an institutional level too. And so that's part of what we're calling for. And so when we are really committing to that, then that has to include paradigmic shifts to the way we understand the work, right? And it has to be multidimensional. It has to happen through kind of our admissions process and what are we committed to and who are we committed to recruiting, to what does the curriculum look like? Do we have people who are equipped to engage in that curriculum? How are we supporting their growth so that they can really engage in these conversations? What about the schools that we partner with or the places or programs or community partners that we have? How are we being purposeful in who we engage with and how we support their own development and growth, right? And so it has to be this multifaceted commitment. It can't live in the hands of, I just hired one person who has these ideologies and they're going to implement all of this for us. It can't live in the, we're going to read a book and then talk about it, which we're doing, which is a great first step, but it can't end there, right? It has to really be a thoughtful, systemic reflection that really has us reflecting on our policies, on practices, on personnel, on demographics, composition, all of those things at the same time.
Great, thank you. It's a challenge, I think, for all of us in schools of ed. So I'm going to go in another direction as well. I loved your chapter on reimagining and reclaiming education, which is about the need for dreaming in education. And so we have enough time for others to ask questions. I won't read a passage, but this is such a good chapter. And what these teachers do is extraordinary. And it's really about throwing out models and creating educational spaces of our dreams. And I mentioned the ethnomathematics and the restorative science pedagogy. And so these examples are so extraordinary. And I'm inspired to dream about education in post-conflict contexts, what I'm looking at now in Northern Ireland and thinking about Ukraine. But what are you dreaming about? And what are you dreaming about for higher education and teacher prep?
Yeah, I love that you asked me this question. It was so nice to take a beat and really reflect on what I'm dreaming about. I would say, the Institute for Teachers of Color Committed to Racial Justice, it has been one of my dreams realized. When I first started out in this work, I've been a clinical teacher educator. I have been a faculty member in a teaching institution where my job was teacher education. And now I'm in a research institution where most of my work is studying teacher ed and teachers, and I still work with teachers. But I think I had previously worked in spaces where I felt like my strengths were not really seen or valued. I felt a lot of resistance. And so it was really powerful to be able to, and empowering to think, okay, I don't have to just spend all of my energy resisting this, this kind of pushback on wanting to think about race and racism, or wanting to think about the dignity of communities of color. I can also sidestep this and create a space where my strengths matter, where the teachers who are in the book, their strengths can matter, where I and they can feel seen, where they can develop the skills they want to grow into the leaders and the justice-oriented educators they dream about being. Because those, I would have students who kind of fit the profile of the teachers in my book, in my classes, few and far between, who felt invisible, right? And there's a lot of research beyond mine that shows that too in teacher education programs, the way that justice-oriented teachers of color often feel in these spaces. And so I think being able to think that if it doesn't exist, we can actually build something and we don't have to fall into the patterns of the status quo stories and the structures that exist, has been really, really powerful and empowering. So we've been running this professional development space for 12 years. We've served over 1,000 teachers in the United States and beyond. And now I'm to a point where I'm starting to build some of the lessons learned and structures from there back into teacher education. And that has been really, really powerful to see, how to, let's leave the institution behind, let's vision something and dream something. And now let's figure out how to build those beautiful, powerful elements back into it.
Oh, that's incredible. That's lovely, Rita. In 12 years, I mean, that's incredible, right? It's over a decade of work. So I want to open up for questions. We have one from Tracy Dennis, but I had one, while other people are thinking of questions, I had one other point in the book that I just, I really found so compelling. And it's on page 82, which is just right in the middle of the book. And you ask this question, diversity at what expense? And this is really talking about teachers' well-being. I mean, teachers who encountered so much hostility in such a hostile, racist environment, like they were physically ill, they had to stop teaching, it's, provoked depression, anxiety. And I was thinking a lot about how this could be said for higher ed. I so deeply appreciated this question. And if you wanted to expand on it at all or say anything, I would love to listen, because I found that really compelling.
I agree with you completely that this is reflected in higher ed and probably in a lot of different professional domains, that there is this frame of diversity and inclusion. And I think equity is added to it sometimes, but isn't always at the forefront of what's done through some of the initiatives, right? And I think the idea that we diversify and we're done, I don't think that from an institutional standpoint, there is a reflection on what happens when we haven't created the conditions to really have people who bring different positionalities, experiences, worldviews, lived experiences, and realities in terms of marginality and oppression into spaces that haven't dealt with that there is a lot of harm that comes from that. I think that in the book, I leverage Derek Bell's frame of interest convergence to point this out, and this idea that, teachers of color bring a lot to schools that have been researched and shown to have material impacts on the lives of students, right? That students of color tend to come to school more. They tend to graduate at higher rates. That there was a study, Chern and Halpin had a study in 2016 that said that students of all races felt like having a diverse teacher workforce was beneficial to their engagement in school, right? And so there are a lot of reasons why there has been a movement to diversify the teaching force. But I think until we really start to think about how racism, structural racism is embedded in the context and how that impacts the racial climate, we are inviting people into climates that are not supportive of their well-being. And I think that that's something we have to take very seriously, because I leverage William Smith's work to talk about racial battle fatigue and the kind of toll that this takes, the physical, physiological, psychological toll that battling and resisting racism every day can take on people of color. And so, this is absolutely true in higher ed. This isn't, this session isn't about me and my experiences in higher ed, but it could be in the relationship to this question. I think that many of us scholars of color who are trying to create change in higher ed are pushing up against things that are really, really draining to our spirits and our souls and our well-being. And so I definitely think that diversity at what expense is a really important concept for us to reflect on as we think about how we're diversifying. What else are we doing to ensure the well-being of that diversity?
Thank you so much, Rita. And it hadn't occurred to me, but that very much connects to this idea of moving beyond the checklist, right? Moving beyond something that's performative. That's just, it's so important, something I want to keep thinking about. So it's time now to turn it over to the audience. And so in ITEP, we involve students in everything. So it's a very ITEP-y thing to do, to have students facilitate part of our events. And we have two grad students here, Cam Brown and Drea Rachel, who are going to facilitate the Q&A. And I will turn it over to the two of them.
All right, hello everyone. Thank you all for joining today. My name is Cam Brown. As Elizabeth said, I'm a graduate assistant with ITEP in my second semester here from Durham, North Carolina. I'm definitely happy to be here and be a part of the forums that ITEP puts on. I'll let Drea introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Drea Rachel. My apologies, I am getting over losing my voice. This is not how I usually sound. I am an ITEP graduate student. It is technically my second year here. I'm working on media literacy and disinformation in the United States versus the Baltic states. And thank you so much for having me help facilitate this.
Well, we can start with the first question in the chat. I believe Tracy Dennis asks, so it was ITOC is such a powerful healing space for minoritized educators. Doing this work, how would you suggest the healing continue during the academic year to avoid burnout and trauma?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that question makes me think, Tracy, have you been to iTalk? I was wondering about that. But the conference, the convening is what before the pandemic was only in the summer. Oh, I see, she says yes. That's exciting. But during the pandemic, we shifted to an online platform. And so we do actually ongoing professional developments and create spaces throughout the year for teachers to come together. We have kind of like bigger Zoom spaces with keynote talks, but we also have mini courses, racial justice mini courses that we've created for people to come together. We have a femtorship space where we help pair people together based on their learning interests, and someone who's maybe not just hierarchical around like how many years have you been in the profession, but based on, this is something I'm interested in growing in, and here's somebody else who has that, and we pair people together around that. So there's lots of ways that we've been doing that work, but I think that there's also, it's really important for teachers to think about who their community is, either locally or, maintaining relationships with people that they've met in other spaces during the year to check in. And because, as we saw in the book, that community of resistance made all the difference. I brought up the story of Bayani, who was in the book. And I think one of the things that he named was when there was something that happened on campus, like an ICE worker for immigration and customs enforcement came on campus and tackled a student, and it was really traumatic. And in the past, he felt like he wouldn't have had anybody to talk to about that, and that would have left him carrying a lot of pain and stress. And instead, because he had this community that he'd built, and I really love his story because he talks about how purposefully it was. It started with going on hikes and having lunches and happy hours and other ways to build with other teachers so they had that kind of authentic relationship. And so when it comes to moments like this, they're on a text thread and they can actually reflect and support each other to process, but then they also were in positions to be organized in their way they responded to the administration about it. Some of the teachers that we work with don't have that at their school sites. And so, you know, this last racial justice mini course we had was on teacher inquiry groups. And so there's a model from New York, from the New York Collective of Radical Educators, where they build these inquiry to action groups with teachers where they come together across the district to kind of join and talk about Islamophobia or how to kind of push back on standardized testing or different topics like that. But then I think there are even, you know, we've had teachers come to us who are like, I am the only Latino teacher, Latinx teacher in my whole district. And so, you know, that is really a challenge. You know, we've had there was a Black teacher who came and she said that she was hired into her school and she was the only Black teacher in her school and one of 5 across the whole district in the city that she lived in. And so coming to this space and having other folks that they've met have been really supportive. And so I think finding those kind of spaces is, you know, iTalk is one, but Education for Liberation is another. I know there's Teachers for Social Justice. There's a lot of spaces like that, especially now in this virtual world, you can kind of jump into from where you're at.
Excuse me. Thank you for that answer. Dre, do you want to ask the next one?
Sure. So the next question is from Sarah Belsen. She says, thank you for sharing this work. And I love how this book brings together so many years of relationships with the teachers you've worked with. You mentioned how you have worked with teachers from across the United States and the world. How much does a sense of place or lack thereof give teachers the ability to negotiate and ultimately reconstruct the systems they work in?
Yeah, what a wonderful question. And it's been very powerful in the space that you're referencing, the iTalk space. I remember a time where we had some teachers who were kind of at the forefront of ethnic studies many years ago in Los Angeles, and they ran some workshops on that. And then we had some teachers who were from a neighboring district in California that met them and built a program in consultation with them because they'd met them at this space. Then we invited those teachers back who had ended up building kind of a district-wide program to present. And we had some teachers from Minnesota come to that. And those teachers were like, wow, we haven't seen things like this in our district. And so they became in consultation with them. And so it, you know, I think the place-based part of it is really important because it, you know, we are in a space where teachers come and we're like, here is curriculum. You know, you're not going to come get a packet that you go back and you put in your classroom the next day. What we're trying to do is have deeper discussions of how racialization and racial inequity work in schools and what are the models that exist to really support racial justice work. And so, you know, there was a teacher who was from Baltimore that I remember, and she was super conscious, super excited to do work. She was a Black teacher working in a predominantly Black school or 99.9% Black school. And when she came to California to be part of this, she mentioned that she had actually never been in a conversation about race and racism with someone who was Asian American before. She'd never heard that struggle. We have teachers who are from a particular region. You know, we had Indigenous teachers coming from the Dakotas, right? Coming and talking about what they're struggling with. And those are, you know, being able to understand these place-based struggles that other folks are going through, I think really helps to develop their interracial, cross-racial literacies that ultimately help us understand how systems of oppression work. So I think there's so much power in the model of kind of bringing people together, especially for teachers. Being a teacher is such local work, right? And when do you get to meet a teacher from Brazil or a teacher from the UK? when you're a teacher from Omaha, Nebraska? Like, when does that happen, right? So I think it's just, it's really powerful and beautiful to see.
Thank you so much. Cam, would you like to take the next question?
All right. So the next one is from louisejenkins. Last week, a satellite charter of the SC Black Educators Association was established in my city. I attended the meeting just so that we would get the charter, and ended up being nominated to join the executive board, which I did. We offer PD for I'm assuming that's professional development for our teachers throughout the year. How do we get in contact with your organization to host a PD?
Oh, that's great. Thanks so much for reaching out. I can put my email in the chat, and you can send me an email, and we'll talk that way. Congratulations.
What do we have next? All right, so the email's in the chat. Cheryl, Dr. Cheryl, she asks, what are the two most important teacher prep changes / modifications in order for us to attract and retain more teachers of color?
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl. That's a great question in terms of thinking about, kind of what I was saying before about diversity, what Lizzie and I were talking about, diversity at what expense. And I do think that's important to consider. I think it's important to consider composition, and critical mass is one of the things that I borrow from my colleagues in higher ed to reflect on. So I work in a teacher education, or at my university, our teacher education program is about 70% students of color. We're a minority serving institution, an HSI and ANAPZ institution. And simultaneously, even though we have so many students of color, we've had multiple years where we've had 2 to 3 Black students in our teacher ed program. And so those students are still experiencing a lot of racial isolation in a space that is a minority serving institution. And so I think that it is important for us to think more complicatedly about what diversity means, what critical mass means. And then I think also to think about how is that diversity in our student population reflected in our teacher educator population? How is it reflected in the kind of curriculum that we read? Are we reading from diverse viewpoints? Are we reading authors of color? Are we, who are the guiding teachers if we're placing them in placements where they have cooperating teachers? Do we have a diverse pool of cooperating teachers? And so really trying to understand multidimensionally what their experience will be. I have a paper with some other colleagues about how to create, towards a healthy racial climate in teacher ed that kind of outlines some of the dimensions, the various dimensions that are really important to supporting that. So I'm happy to kind of send that along as well.
Okay, Jerry, you want to ask the next one?
Sure. So the next question is from Danielle Sadani. She says, thank you for your work in support of teachers of color. Do you have examples or suggestions for ways schools or colleges of education can partner with school systems to create healing communities?
Yeah, that's great. I know community schools work is getting a lot of movement these days, where schools are really thinking about how do they partner with nonprofits and other community organizations, churches, after school programs, all these different support spaces, lawyers, social workers, to kind of create these wraparound services for families. And I think it's also important to think about that kind of community school model as it relates to community responsive teacher education. And so how are we seeing relationships between a university and schools in the communities? We have a lot of resources in terms of the cutting edge scholarship that we're engaging in, the ways in which we have a responsibility in terms of the ways in which we are shaping education, and how are we kind of doing that in partnership with schools. I think a lot about, I don't know how many people here saw when the teacher at North High School in Riverside who dressed up with feathers and was dancing to teach a math lesson. I don't know, it kind of went viral if people saw that. So that is a school where we have student teachers partnered at, student teachers are placed at that school. And that had a deep impact on the student teachers in our program. And so that, thinking about how do we think of ourselves as a connected community is really important when we think about the healing that students have to engage in, and the processing that students have to engage in when something like that happens. Because schools don't exist in isolation, our institutions don't exist in isolation, and the more that we can sort of share resources and agendas towards racial justice, I think the more powerful it can be.
Thank you. Kim, would you like to take the next question?
I think you're on mute.
So next one is from Corbin Campbell. First, thank you for being here. I deeply appreciate your work and can't wait to read your book. In SOE, we are pursuing multiple pathways to prepare anti-racist teachers, including both traditional pathways and alternative pathways, because a racially diverse teacher pool may require multiple ways to access teaching as a career. How can we prepare teachers through multiple pathways to ultimately succeed and be retained as anti-racist educators in schools?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I mean, I think navigating the racial climate of schools is really challenging for teachers of color, as my book outlines. And I think one of the things is, how are we having the conversation so that teachers are prepared and that they have the resources and tools to do that? I think that connects to Kat's question right above it about, how are we maintaining relationships with teachers once they enter the classroom? How are we maintaining, if we start to think about the question before that about the partnerships, if we have partnerships with schools, if we're able to build these kind of reciprocal relationships that are committed to similar goals, I think that we can start to move the model that we think about is we're not just producing teachers, right? We're in community, in cultivating spaces that are where teachers can continue to grow, where we can have cooperating teachers who are engaged in that work too. But I do think it comes down to having a shared commitment to this racial literacy, right? It can't just be held in a social foundations course. It can't just be held by one or two people in a program. These are commitments that have to be shared across all members of the community. And so that when things come up, one of the things that I talk about a lot is that we have to expect that racism is going to happen, right? Like the example that I talked about with North High School, we don't live in a bubble. Our program isn't in a bubble. We have to expect that that's going to happen. And what are the processes that exist? What are the systems that we have in place to really support it when it happens? That incident happened a couple of years before that. There were some teachers at Rubida High School who went out online and were expressing about a day without immigrants, and they were put on leave because they were disparaging families that engaged in protest and Latinx families. And, this is something, so we're having multiple years, we're having similar incidents in the local community. And what are the systems and processes that we have in place, right? How do we, expect, anticipate, and respond to those things? That really matters, in addition to a curriculum that's responsive.
I'm actually going to jump in here, Cam and Drea, because I'm being mindful of the time, and we just have 3 minutes left, and we have some really interesting and complex questions left in the chat. Rita, I don't know if you just want to take 10 seconds and look at those real quick and maybe speak to them in the last minute, and then I can wrap us up. Sorry, Cam and Drea, I just figured I should jump in before you all tried to read one of those out.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think this comment by Emily especially is really hitting me, and especially during the pandemic and kind of the racial movement of 2020 of like anti-racist education and the promotion of this, where people are they're being asked to take on this work, and they are, and then they're being critiqued for it or pushed out because of it. And so I do think that as we diversify, there's also this issue of newer teachers, the last in, the first out. So I mean, I think that there are ways that school districts can make commitments. If a teacher has a special skill set that they're bringing, then they don't count as the last in, right? They can be put into a different category. So there are ways around this. And so I think there has to be pressure on districts too, as they make these commitments to, I think there was a movement, at least in the district where I live, to increase the number of Black teachers, right? And then, but if there's this hiring movement and then we have pink slips and people are being pushed out, that becomes really complicated. And so what are the commitments of the district to thinking about that, or the union to thinking about that in a different way, right? And so I think having real conversations about the implications of racism is fundamental to this. I think we take race-based approaches, or we dance around the racial implications of things. Going back to that notion of status quo stories, like this is how we live equity, and this is how equity works. And that by understanding it through one lens around seniority, we're also marginalizing people in another way, right? And I think that we have to be able to start to have that kind of real conversation about race and racism.
Rita, what a wonderful note to end on. That I think brought us back to earlier points in the conversation, and just a fitting point to end. And so at this point it's 7, so I'll close out our first ever Charles Tosconi lecture featuring Rita Kohli. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.